On today's episode of Watch Wednesday, we are entering the discussion of vintage versus modern. The first stop on our journey is the Watch Preserve for cars, coffee, and chronos.
Hey everybody, my name is Michael Pandolfo. I do sales and content creation here at the Watch Preserve in Fort Worth, Texas. One of the reasons that I love vintage watches over modern watches, and I love modern watches, I have modern watches, but for me, vintage watches offer better value and more uniqueness. You'll find, I think, when you wear a vintage watch, a certain level of quality in every detail you might not find in modern watches at the same price point. I've seen $200 Hamiltons from the 1930s and 40s that are built with every level of detail and execution, just as much as some modern Swiss watches in the $2,000 price point. We are at a car show. Every time you buy a vintage watch, you're buying a little piece of history. Whether it's a design that's not made anymore or a movement that's not made anymore, even things like the kinds of paint and materials used to make that watch all add to the uniqueness and the value of that vintage piece, which for me is one of the reasons why I have grown so much to love vintage watches.
Okay, so Preston ended up getting a watch at the Watch Preserve. He got a Hamilton. We'll talk about that in a future video, but on to stop 2 of our adventure today of watch and car shows. Heading to Wolvyn now. They're having a car show with watches as well. See if I can get in there and interview Josh before this gets really busy.
To everybody who doesn't know, my name is Josh Navarro. I own one of the largest gray market dealers in all of Texas, if not the largest. We're out of Plano, Texas, up here pretty much near Frisco. If you guys are looking for any watch, vintage or modern, we're your guys. And so that kind of leads me into what we're going to talk about today. The pros and cons between vintage and modern watches. You know, without vintage watches, we wouldn't be where we are today with innovation, inspiration, and mechanical advancement. And so for me, though, with just seeing how watches have come so far, one of the things I love about modern watches versus vintage is, you know, when I saw watches like the Daytona 6265 and, you know, Paul Newman's and different things like that, what I was really taken aback is how dainty they feel and how light they feel. You know, back in the day, we didn't have solid stainless steel links. It was folded over steel to create the form of the link. And so a lot of times that's where you get that jangly bracelet, a lot of stretch in the bracelet, versus with modern watches, you know, especially like the Submariner, you have solid steel links and you have all these new things like the glide lock system. So for you guys who may not know, glide lock system is a thing that Rolex has come out with in their class. All you have to do is unclick it, slide the bracelet out, and you have adjustment on the fly. So there's things like that that I really love. Also, you know, things like caliber movements have gotten way better power reserves Back in the day, you had 36, hours, even less, depending on the model. Now you have watches that can go even like Jorn has a 30-day or 31-day power reserve watch, which is insanity. There's watches that mostly have, for the most part, are 72 hours and above. And so it's pretty crazy to see where these watches have come, how they do things. Now, there is a romance with old vintage watches on how they were handcrafted, but brands like Patek and Jorn and even AP, they still have models where they really put in that hand finishing into their watches, and I think it's really cool. And so, there's brands like this Richard Mille, for instance, they were one of the biggest innovators when it came to materials. So now you have things like titanium, carbon fiber, ceramics, and things of that nature to really give different uses for watches. So those are just things that I love about the modern genre of watches that I think just are a pro over vintage watches. You kind of get that lackluster thing with some of these vintage sometimes. Some watch, not every, and that's the other thing too. Beauty's in the eye of the beholder when it comes to vintage. So there's certain patinas and certain things that look really good, but there's a lot of watches that didn't really patina that nicely and they kind of look crappy. So you really have to be careful when you're buying vintage. That's another part that is stressful, is you really got to know what you're buying. With vintage watches, you can go to the wrong dealer and you can have a Frankenstein watch that's been pieced together. You can have a watch that has aftermarket parts or been serviced, 17 times by the wrong watchmaker. And so that's where you got to be really careful. And so with modern watches, you just kind of get that peace of mind of knowing that these watches haven't really been tampered with. The other thing to keep in mind with modern watches is that they haven't been serviced as much. And they usually are, especially with the way people wear watches nowadays, they're just taken care of better. There's watchmakers that polish watches now versus back in the day, jewelers would polish a watch and make it look terrible. And so there's a lot of different new assets that we have in the watch world that weren't available in the past. And so anyways, I know that's kind of going off a little bit, but in general, I just think that with modern, you really a lot of times get what you pay for, and it feels it and is substantial. And there's a lot of innovation and technology that's taken watches to new heights. And so it's really exciting to see where watches are, where they're at and where they're headed. So I'm looking forward to seeing more innovation coming to the watch world, and that's why I like modern watches.
So having heard both sides of the argument, and for me, now I've both owned a modern and a vintage Rolex, I think it boils down to user experience. Now, I was talking to my friend Fred about this, and I think if we're sticking with the car theme of the day, we can draw a lot of parallels to Porsches. So when we think about vintage Porsches versus modern Porsches, there's a lot of similarities in the comparison between vintage Rolex and modern Rolex. We talk about materials, we talk about power, we talk about sizing, we talk about advancements in technology, we talk about how hard they are to get, rarity, uniqueness of little details and characteristics. So I think there is a big parallel there, but the biggest difference between a vintage Porsche and a modern Porsche is driver experience or user experience. So driving a vintage Porsche is a very, very different experience than driving a modern Porsche, especially if you're daily driving it or if you're putting it on the track. So however you use it, it's going to be different. And I think the same is true of vintage versus modern watches, not just Rolex, but watches in general. There is a different experience wearing a vintage watch because of the sizing, the thinness, the power reserve. You have to wind them more. They take a little more care, cost of ownership. If they get damaged, are you gonna be able to replace those parts? Is it something unique that you won't see anywhere else because they don't make that anymore? As opposed to the modern watches, they're more technologically advanced, better materials, different materials than what they had in the past. Just a different look, different sizing all the way around. So again, ultimately for me, I think it all boils down to user experience. Now, you're gonna have to decide for yourself what type of person you are, what your personality is, what your style is, what suits you and your lifestyle best, vintage versus modern. And nobody can tell you that, something you've just gotta figure out. But what I will say from experience is that you can't go wrong with either. They're both great, whether you use vintage or modern, they are very different, but they are both something that you will enjoy for years to come. Now, for me, having had both, if I had to pick one for the next watch, if I knew I was gonna get another watch tomorrow, it would probably be a modern watch. And that's just me, that's just my personality. And given I already have a vintage watch, although it's not mine, I'm giving it to somebody else. But having experienced that and having experienced modern, if I had to buy another one today, it would probably be a modern watch or a neo vintage, something along those lines. Just there is something about vintage that in certain ways is a little more delicate. Again, this goes back to lifestyle because of what I do, shooting guns so much, and what I do around overlanding, and just my lifestyle doesn't suit wearing a vintage watch daily, especially something that is maybe a little more rare, something that I may have a hard time getting parts to replace, and the way that I want to take care of it and keep it. So for me, it would probably be a modern, but for you, it may be different. Now, whichever way you decide to go, thank you again to the Watch Preserve for chiming in. Also, check them out if you're interested in vintage. Also, thank you to Wolvyn Luxury Timepieces. They are sponsors of the channel and sponsors of the series. They make it happen. So very thankful for them. If you are looking for a modern watch, a vintage watch, a neo vintage watch, whatever it is, you let them know, they'll find it for you. The customer service is amazing, great guys. So check them out. And do me a favor, let me know in the comments what you would choose. And if you had to choose a vintage or a modern watch, which would it be? What watch specifically? Thank you guys for following along. Make sure that like, subscribe, karate chop that bell so you get notified every time I upload a video, and I will see you guys in the next one.